7th of September, 1943. Westward, ho! On the North Devon coast. The tide is out, the sand is flat and hard, and along the seafront, the deck chairs are still up, because nobody has bothered to take them down. It is meant to be a secret. It is not a secret. Word has gone round the village for days that something strange is coming to the beach, and by mid-morning, a crowd of holidaymakers, children, dogs, and at least one ice cream vendor has gathered on the dunes to watch. Down on the landing craft, moored just offshore, a group of naval officers in overalls make final adjustments to a machine that, from a distance, looks like nothing so much as two enormous cartwheels joined by a steel drum. Someone gives the order. A fizzing, hissing roar erupts from dozens of small rocket tubes bolted around the wheel rims, and the contraption lurches off the ramp, hits the water, and begins to spin its way towards the shore at a speed that startles everyone watching, not least the men who built it. This is the Panjandrum. Specifically, it is the first public trial of a device that its creators hoped might solve one of the single greatest tactical problems facing Britain and her allies in the Second World War. How to get an invasion force through a wall of concrete without simply feeding men into machine gun fire until the wall gave way. For a few seconds, as it storms up the beach, trailing smoke and sparks, the Panjandrum looks like it might actually work. Then a rocket clamp fails. Then another. The great wheel begins to wobble, then to turn, then to career sideways across the sand in a shower of loose rockets, sending spectators scrambling for the dunes, and the film cameraman scrambling for his life. It does not hit the wall it was built to destroy, because there is no wall here, only a beach full of very startled tourists. But somewhere underneath the farce, there is a serious idea, born of desperation, that very nearly changed how the Allies broke into occupied Europe. Nobody remembers the Panjandrum today, the way they remember the Spitfire or the Enigma codebreakers. It survives mostly as a punchline, a favorite bit of wartime whimsy trotted out to show how eccentric British boffins could be when left unsupervised. That reputation is not entirely undeserved, but behind the comedy lies a genuinely urgent engineering problem, a genuinely clever piece of physics, and a series of test failures so spectacular that they are still being replayed, quite literally, by hobbyists building their own electric versions for fun nearly 80 years later. To understand why the Admiralty ever thought a giant burning wheel was a sensible answer to Hitler's coastal defenses, you first have to understand just how impossible that defense looked from the British side of the Channel. By the early months of 1943, the shape of the war in the West had become horribly clear to Allied planners. Germany occupied the entire coastline of northern France, the Low Countries, and much of Norway. And Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of a continuous belt of fortifications along it, a project that came to be known as the Atlantic Wall. It was not a wall in any simple sense, but a vast, layered system of concrete gun emplacements, pillboxes, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and barbed wire, stretching for well over 2,500 kilometers from the Spanish border to the Arctic Circle. The most heavily defended sections, guarding the beaches most likely to be chosen for a cross-channel invasion, included reinforced concrete walls roughly 3 meters high and over 2 meters thick, backed by bunkers whose gun crews had clear, unobstructed fields of fire across open sand. The maths of attacking such a position by conventional means was bleak. Naval gunfire could pound the coastline for hours without guaranteeing a breach in properly reinforced concrete of that thickness. Aerial bombing was inaccurate enough that hitting a specific stretch of wall from altitude under fire was closer to luck than skill. That left the oldest and cruelest solution available to any army: send men across open beaches carrying explosive charges by hand, and hope enough of them survived contact with machine gun and mortar fire to lay their charges and detonate the wall themselves. Military planners looking at the casualty projections for a frontal assault of this kind did not like what they saw. Every additional meter a soldier had to cross in the open, under fire, translated into more dead and wounded before the invasion had properly begun. Something needed to deliver a very large quantity of high explosive against a fixed concrete target without requiring a human being to walk it there under fire, and nothing then in service could do it reliably. This was the exact sort of problem that Britain's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development had been created to chase. Known informally and rather fondly as the Wheezers and Dodgers, the DMWD was an Admiralty outfit staffed by naval officers, scientists and engineers, whose job was essentially to solve problems nobody else wanted to touch, using whatever combination of ingenuity and improvisation the problem demanded. It sat alongside similarly unconventional bodies working on secret weaponry for the coming invasion, and it had already produced both triumphs and curiosities in equal measure, including the highly effective Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar that went on to sink a meaningful number of German U-boats. Now it turned its attention to the Atlantic Wall, and one of its officers, a young sub-lieutenant named Neville Shute Norway, sat down to work out exactly how much explosive would be needed to blow a tank-sized hole through several feet of reinforced concrete from a standing start on an open beach. Shute, who would later become far better known to the public as the novelist Neville Shute, author of A Town Like Alice and On the Beach, calculated that the job would require, in the region of 1 long ton of high explosive, more than 1,000 kilograms, delivered directly against the base of the wall. That was an extraordinary quantity to move across open sand under fire by conventional means. It ruled out infantry entirely, and made even armored vehicles a risky proposition, since anything large enough to carry that much explosive would also be large enough to make an excellent target. The specification that came out of these calculations demanded something almost paradoxical: a device cheap and simple enough to build in numbers, capable of carrying over 1 ton of explosive, able to launch itself from a landing craft out at sea, and able to cross open beach sand under its own power, fast enough that enemy gunners would have little time to stop it. Nothing resembling this existed. So the DMWD decided to build it from scratch, and the answer they arrived at was, in the most literal sense imaginable, a very large wheel. The design that emerged from the DMWD's workshops and from a contract quietly awarded to a firm called Commercial Structures Limited in Leytonstone, East London, was disarmingly simple in concept, even if it proved fiendishly difficult in practice. 2 wooden wheels, each roughly 10 feet across, about 3 meters, were built with steel treads around their rims and mounted on a shared axle. Between them sat a steel drum designed to hold the explosive payload, effectively turning the whole assembly into an enormous rolling barrel bomb. Around the outer rim of each wheel, engineers bolted dozens of solid-fuel cordite rockets, the same basic propellant technology used in service rocketry of the period, arranged so that their combined thrust would spin the wheels and drive the entire machine forward under its own power, rather like a Catherine wheel the size of a small bus. The physics behind it was, in fairness, sound enough on paper. A wheel that large, spun fast enough by rocket thrust around its circumference, could in theory generate enormous forward momentum and simply flatten anything in its path, the way a heavy flywheel resists being stopped once it is turning at speed. Early calculations suggested that a fully loaded Panjandrum, carrying close to 2 tons, including its explosive charge, might reach speeds in the region of 60 miles an hour, roughly 100 kilometers an hour, which is considerably faster than most people can sprint across wet sand. At that speed and mass, the designers believed, nothing short of the Atlantic Wall itself would be able to stop it. And the wall itself was, of course, precisely the point. The prototype, built in secrecy at Leytonstone and moved by night to avoid attention, weighed close to 2 tons fully loaded and stood taller than a man at the axle. For the early trials, the DMWD wisely chose to fill the central drum with an equivalent weight of sand rather than live explosive, a decision that would prove to be one of the more sensible calls made during the entire project. Getting from a workable idea on a drawing board to a controllable weapon on a beach, however, turned out to be an entirely different matter. And it is here that the Panjandrum's short operational history becomes, frankly, difficult to tell without laughing, even though the underlying intent was deadly serious. The first trial at WWII on September the 7th, 1943, demonstrated immediately that spinning 2 large wheels using dozens of independently burning rockets was not a simple thing to keep balanced. If the rockets on one side burned even slightly faster or hotter than those on the other, the whole device would begin to curve, and once it began to curve, the imbalance only grew worse. On that first run, several rockets tore loose from their mountings entirely, and the Panjandrum veered wildly off its intended line long before reaching anything resembling a target. The DMWD's response was to add more rockets, eventually somewhere in the region of 70 of them, in the hope that greater symmetry and greater thrust would smooth out the wobble. It did not. Subsequent trials saw engineers fit a third stabilizing wheel to keep the machine upright, and later attempt a rudimentary steering system using heavy steel cables anchored to winches on the beach, an approach that might have worked on something moving at walking pace, but proved wildly inadequate against a machine accelerating under rocket thrust. The cables did not so much steer the Panjandrum as get snapped by it, whipping back across the sand with enough force to injure anyone standing nearby, which, understandably, alarmed everybody within range. Test after test through the autumn and winter of 1943 produced broadly the same result: a promising launch, a period of genuinely impressive acceleration, and then some combination of a detached rocket, a snapped cable, or an unexpected dip in the sand, sending the whole device spinning off in a direction nobody had planned for. If you are finding this story as entertaining as I am, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think, and there is a great deal more of this particular corner of the war still to come. By January 1944, the DMWD had persevered long enough and invested enough effort to arrange what amounted to a showcase trial, inviting senior naval officers, government scientists, and official photographers to WWII to witness what they hoped would finally be a controlled and convincing demonstration. According to the account later given in the BBC documentary series The Secret War, the test began well enough. The Panjandrum rolled off its landing craft, entered the water, and began powering towards the beach, while the assembled admirals and generals watched through binoculars from the safety, or so they assumed, of a pebble ridge above the sand. Then a rocket clamp failed, then a second, then a third, and the wheel began to lurch off course exactly as it had done every time before, except this time it was heading directly for the crowd of senior officers rather than an empty stretch of beach. Naval photographer Lieutenant Louis Clementaschi, filming events through a telescopic lens, apparently misjudged the closing distance and kept filming until the roar of an approaching rocket-shedding wheel forced him to run for his life. The gathered brass hats, by most accounts, dived for cover behind the pebble ridge, some of them into a stretch of barbed wire, as the Panjandrum tore up the beach, shedding live rockets in every direction before finally crashing to a halt and disintegrating in the sand. It was, by any reasonable measure, an unqualified disaster, and it effectively ended serious consideration of the weapon. It is worth being honest about what is and is not well documented here. The broad sequence of events, the failed clamps, the diving officers, the panicked cameraman, comes from contemporary accounts and from the recollections gathered decades later for that BBC documentary. And it has been repeated so often that some details, such as precisely how many officers dived for cover, or exactly how close the wheel came to anyone, have likely gathered a little polish in the retelling. What is not in doubt, because the DMWD's own project records confirm it, is that the Panjandrum never once completed a controlled run across a beach in any of its trials, and that the project was effectively wound down not long after that January demonstration. No Panjandrum was ever built with a live explosive charge fitted for use in earnest, and none was ever deployed operationally on D-Day or at any other point in the war. Unlike weapons developed by resistance groups or used in specific documented raids, there are no operational deployment records to draw on here, because there were none. Its entire combat history consists of trials on English beaches, watched by increasingly nervous spectators. It is instructive, even so, to place the Panjandrum alongside what Germany and the United States were doing to solve similar beach obstacle problems, because it shows both how unusual the British approach was and why other nations largely avoided it. The Germans, defending rather than attacking, had comparatively little need for a mobile breaching charge of this kind, though they did experiment with remote-controlled demolition vehicles such as the Goliath tracked mine, a small, cable-guided tracked carrier packing a few hundred kilograms of explosive, intended to be driven into enemy positions and detonated by an operator watching from cover. The Goliath was slower, far smaller in payload, at roughly half a ton of explosive against the Panjandrum's intended ton-plus, and considerably more controllable, since it was guided the entire way by wire rather than left to fling itself forward on rocket thrust. The Americans, for their part, put their effort into specialized armor and combat engineering solutions, developing tank-mounted demolition charges and the various obstacle-clearing devices that would eventually be grouped under the popular nickname of Hobart's Funnies when used by British forces on D-Day itself. Vehicles such as flail tanks for clearing mines and bridge-laying tanks for crossing obstacles, all of which relied on a crude, armored, steerable platform rather than an unmanned projectile. Put simply, everybody else solved the problem by keeping a human being in careful control of the machine at every stage. The Panjandrum's entire audacious premise was to remove the human being from the equation altogether and trust in raw mass and rocket power instead. And it was precisely that absence of fine control which doomed it. The historical impact of the Panjandrum, then, is almost entirely psychological rather than material, and mostly psychological in retrospect rather than at the time. It never fired a shot, never breached a wall, and never killed an enemy soldier, because it never left British soil under anything other than test conditions. Its real legacy lies in what it represents about the sheer scale of improvisation that British scientists and engineers were willing to attempt when faced with a seemingly unsolvable tactical problem, and in the lessons its failure quietly fed into later thinking about beach obstacle clearance, where the DMWD's other, more successful projects, together with the specialized armor eventually used on D-Day, drew on hard experience about just how difficult it was to control a heavy device moving fast across sand under its own power. Surviving fragments of Panjandrum hardware are scarce, since so little of the equipment survived its own trials intact. But elements connected to the project and photographs of the tests can be found in British military archives and museum collections, including material held by the Imperial War Museum. And the story itself has taken on a strange second life. Engineering enthusiasts have since built small-scale electric versions purely for the pleasure of racing them, an updated echo of a weapon that never quite worked, being reborn as a hobbyist's amusement. Return for a moment to that beach at Westward Ho, September 1943, the deck chairs still up, the crowd gathering on the dunes, the hiss and roar of cordite rockets catching light along the rim of a wheel taller than a man. What those startled holidaymakers were watching, without fully knowing it, was Britain at its most inventive and its most improvisational, a nation so determined to find an answer to an apparently impossible problem that it was willing to build something as strange, as ambitious, and ultimately as uncontrollable as a 2-ton exploding wheel and roll it, quite literally, into the sea. The Panjandrum never breached a single meter of the Atlantic Wall. It never carried a live charge into battle, never faced a German defender, and never justified the 1 long ton of explosive that Neville Shute had calculated it would need. Judged purely by outcome, it was a failure, and a spectacularly public one at that, immortalised on film, chasing its own senior officers up a Devon beach. But judged as an idea, it deserves rather more credit than the punchline it has become. It was born from a real and urgent problem, designed to save the lives of the men who would otherwise have had to carry that explosive across open sand by hand, under fire, with no wheel and no rocket standing between them and a German gun. It failed not because the underlying physics was foolish, but because building a machine that could reliably control 70 independently burning rockets on an unpredictable beach in 1943 was simply beyond the engineering tools available at the time. Every wobble, every snapped cable, every rocket that tore loose and screamed off across the sand was a small, expensive lesson in exactly how hard the problem of unmanned, self-propelled demolition really was. Lessons that quietly informed the specialized armor and obstacle-clearing vehicles that did, in the end, help open the way onto the Normandy beaches the following June. The Panjandrum did not win the war. It did not even survive its own testing program. What it did do was prove, in the most dramatic and undignified way imaginable, that Britain would try almost anything rather than accept that a problem had no solution, and that sometimes the most memorable failures are the ones that come closest to changing history, right up until the moment the rockets come loose.